cadaverous laceration.
The year is 2001. At the time, I lived in a small village called Ambergate in Derbyshire, famous for having a pub with a silly name, and the periodic invasion of the village by a giant ladybird. For kids in the village, there are really only two options: either go outside and cause trouble, usually by pushing a wheelie bin filled with gravel down some stairs, or stay inside and play video games. Luckily for any old ladies who happened to use those stairs, we tended to choose the second option. It was during this time that I was properly introduced to the Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver at my friend Archie's house. At that point, pretty much every kid in our village had a PS1, because, thanks to the PS2 being out, they were dirt cheap. This meant that everyone traded and lent out games to each other, and it also meant that I was introduced to games like Metal Gear Solid, Duke Nukem 3D, and Rainbow Six. Not forgetting, of course, the whole reason that we're here. Soul Reaver. Soul Reaver was the first game in the Legacy of Kain series that I, or any of my friends, had ever played. It featured a dark fantasy world and a story of brutal betrayal among immortal vampires, sired by an aristocratic leader, who also happened to have green skin for some reason. For its day, the graphics were pretty good, and it certainly managed to capture a cinematic feeling, even if the graphics haven't aged that well. At least the voice acting is still good.
So it unfolds, and we are a step closer to our destinies.
Soul Reaver tells the story of Raziel, Vampire Lieutenant Kain, ruler and sire of the vampires. In this universe, vampires evolve differently to humans. Instead of a gradual process, they go into a state of change and emerge before long with some new gift. Usually, Kain would evolve something new first, then his lieutenants would follow shortly afterwards. But one day, Raziel out-evolved his master, growing wings before Kain. This threw him into a rage, and he ripped off Raziel's wings, throwing him into the Lake of the Dead. Time passes strangely in the vortex, and Raziel finds himself decaying and burning, falling for what feels like an eternity, before landing at the feet of an elder god who enlists the newly resurrected Raziel as an agent of revenge. He emerges into the world to find that centuries have gone by, and the land he once knew has been twisted and deformed, much like the beasts he once called brother. Raziel awakens with some new powers once he's finished turning into mouldy jerky. Firstly, he now feeds on souls instead of blood, which, at least in concept, feels like it should be less gross. When at full health, he can wield the Soul Reaver, or at the very least, the spiritual version of it. He also has the ability to phase between the material and spectral planes. The material plane is the real world, as the rest of the world sees it, and the spectral plane is the plane of spirits, inhabited by ghosts and other strange creatures. The spectral physical world dichotomy becomes one of the game's most interesting features. It is used to progress past seemingly impossible obstacles, solve puzzles, and even take on certain varieties of enemies and bosses. See, the spectral realm has a few interesting properties. Firstly, it's built differently from the material world, so if something is in the way or you can't climb it, then you need to check the spectral world to make sure that you can't progress that way. The spectral realm also gives you more ghostly properties, like the ability to walk along the bottom of lakes or ponds, and eventually the ability to phase through the bars on a gate. The last thing that the spectral world does is act as a safety net. In the physical world, you can take damage from combat, die by drowning, well, technically you're burned alive or dissolved or something, and even just get trapped in the wrong place. But when you run out of health, you just phase back into the spectral realm, where there are usually some weak enemies you can feast on to get yourself back to full strength. Then you just pop into a fresh corpse and away you go. The combat is pretty good in the game, relying on dodging and striking to take out your enemies. As well as attacking with your sharp little claws, or with the Soul Reaver if you're lucky, you can pick up a bunch of different weapons. There are swords, spears, flaming sticks, even bigger swords. You can even just knock someone out and throw them in a fire. In fact, for some of the enemies, you can't kill them at all just by hitting them. When you're fighting vampiric enemies, you have to render them unconscious first, and then find one of their weaknesses to finish the job. This can be a patch of sunlight, a pool of water, a flaming pit, or one of the various spikes on the walls that exist for some reason. These vampiric enemies are a ton more fun to fight than the regular ones, mainly because you actually have to think about finishing them off instead of just beating them back repeatedly. This becomes especially complex when you have multiple enemies and have to knock them all out so you can take out one of them for good without being disturbed by a spike to the face. The main joy of the gameplay is probably the exploration. For the PS1, this game was pretty massive, and you needed to solve a decent amount of puzzles to get around. as well as exploring every nook and cranny for bonuses and collectibles. The puzzles range anywhere from platforming segments where you have to use your tattered wing skin to glide around the place, block pushing puzzles to press down on switches or complete glyphs, and timing puzzles to crush your enemies with giant spiky blenders. Why does he even have that in his room? There are even a few environmental puzzles, like having to burn these wooden supports down so that the lift will fall to where you are. Each boss you defeat progresses the story, and provides you with a new power based on the soul that you just devoured. You learn to phase through bars, climb walls, even swim without burning to a crisp. These powers do end up making the game feel a little Metroidvania-y, which isn't a bad thing. You'll probably go past the entrance to later portions of the game before you have the powers needed to access them, then have to return later on to explore there. There are also some things like health upgrades which you have to do some minor backtracking for later on, luckily with the aid of these portals. As the game progresses, you learn more about your relationship with Kain, even confronting him on several occasions with pretty intense boss battles. You discover the true nature of you and your brothers before Kain made you into his vampiric commanders. You discover secrets about the far past and the far future, and there are many hints that maybe Kain isn't exactly as you think of him. The story goes to a lot of interesting places, but leaves somewhat on a cliffhanger. Spoiler warning, so skip this bit if you don't want to know what happens. You confront Kain in a device called the Chronoplast, and despite Kain trying to tell you that the Seraphim weren't as good-natured as he thought, Raziel refuses to listen and the two fight. Before a killing blow can be struck by either side, however, the Chronoplast is activated, and Kain escapes into a time portal, quickly followed by Raziel. Fortunately, Soul Reaver actually does have a legacy. A Legacy of Kain! For those who don't know, Soul Reaver is actually a sequel to Blood Omen, the game which explains a lot of Kain's past. Soul Reaver then got its own sequel with Soul Reaver 2, which shows what happens to Kain and Raziel once they've gone through the time portal. The games finally culminate in The Legacy of Kain Defiance, in which you play as both Kain and Raziel, employing both spiritual and vampiric powers to their fullest, not to mention the same badass voices. Defiance did a really good job of tying up the series, even if it would have been nice to see some more stuff in the world of Nosgoth in more recent years. Okay, so there actually have been some more recent dives into Nosgoth. Firstly, you could play as Raziel and Kain in those isometric shooter Tomb Raider games, like we mentioned in our top 5 2-player games video. Plug. But apart from that, there actually was a game released on Steam called Nosgoth. It was a class-based third-person shooter being developed by Psyonix, in which you took control of a character and had to try and murder the other team while running around a dark fantasy world. It wasn't all that great, honestly, and there wasn't many people playing it. Needless to say, it was cancelled about 6 or 7 months after it went into open beta, and no one even talks about it these days. I was probably one of the few people who even knew it existed at the time. It's a real shame that there haven't been any more real entries into the series since 2003, so we have to content ourselves with constantly replaying the first 4 games. We don't talk about Blood Omen 2. Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver is a fantastic game, which is really the only introduction that you need to the series. It has amazing exploration and deeply involving plot. And I mean, come on, just listen to these voices.
Cadaverous laceration.
If you've never tried Soul Reaver, then you really should play it as soon as you can. And since Soul Reaver 1 and 2 are available on Steam these days, you really have no reason not to. You know, unless you don't have a PC, in which case you're a freak! Hey, thank you for watching our video about Soul Reaver. Give it a like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to see more videos.